Greetings and welcome to another edition of The Pedal Shift Project. The Pedal Shift Project is a series of conversations, thoughts, and experiments on bicycle travel adventures. From tips and tricks to ideas on how to ride your ride. Let's shrink the world by bike. Show notes and more are available at pedalshift.net/361. And you can email the show at pedalshift@pedalshift.net or text me at 202-930-1109 and check Pedal Shift out on all the socials as well. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 361st edition of the Pedal Shift Project. My name's Tim Mooney. Thanks so much for joining. On this edition, we are doing something I probably shouldn't do, and that is to talk more about things that I am barely competent to do, and that is to talk about the science of cycling. This is Cycling Science 101. I am doing this as much for me as it is for you because, frankly, some of this stuff I knew but didn't really know, and so, of course, I'm going to talk about it as if I do know about it. I think join me for the journey. However, before we get into all of that, some programming notes, because I'm realizing as I'm looking at the calendar that things are clicking into place for definitely the remainder of the spring and into, I would argue, the beginning of the summer as well. So let's start with the early stuff. Best of coming next week, always at the top of the month. You know the drill with that. We'll be doing more of the beginner series over the next couple of months, and I think they are fun and you will enjoy them. After that, the spring tour preview is going to be coming the week after that, which I cannot tell you how excited I am. I really am needing to get out on a bike very badly. And as I said here right now, that's going to be happening. The tour journal will begin for you, the gentle listener, the following week. That's going to take us through the bulk of that part of the spring. But there's more. If you've been paying any attention to the show for any period of time and maybe looked into the Wayback Machine and saw when this show commenced, you know this. We are on the march to the 10-year anniversary of the show. Absolutely bananas that this show, this little pod has been going on for 10 years, but here we are. I have decided that we're going to do a live show to celebrate things. That is going to occur on June 8th with a time to be announced. I'm going to try to make it so that it fits as many time zones as possible to maximize things. But I wanted to give everybody a real early look at the calendar on this. So mark that all down. As always, with all live shows, they're not as frequent as I would like them to be, but they are always podcasted. They are podcast the following week. So if you cannot join us live, you will get a chance to at least celebrate from afar, time shifted, etc., etc. But always down for some live fun banter with everyone. Come on down. It will be on June 8th, and I will make sure that that is all at pedalshift.net/live at some point in the near future, along with the time. So, like I said, mark it down. 10 years of Pedal Shift celebrating. Should be fun. All right, let's talk about things that I should not be talking about. Famously, I am trained as a lawyer, and I am a lawyer, and so I should not be talking about science. However, little known fact, I actually graduated from undergrad with a degree, a bachelor's of science. So technically, I am a scientist. No, I am not. However, I do feel like I've got a little bit of curiosity in the science of cycling, and probably even more so now that I've been getting into the ins and outs of building a bike, as that's been part of the exploration process for this e-bike. And of course, that's gotten into batteries and electronics and things like that. But I'm also really curious about the basics of how bicycles just work. They're remarkable machines. And after spending a little more time getting into it, I'm excited to share a little bit more about the science of everything and why bicycles may be the most efficient machine ever made. It's certainly really remarkable. And this is not exactly going to be a real comprehensive look at the science of cycling, but I think fun enough for those of you who have ever considered or thought about, hey, how does this all work? So let's start off with the physics of cycling. And the interesting elements of all of this are probably in the drivetrain part of things. But I think what a lot of folks don't think about is what we're fighting. And what we're fighting is resistance. In order to move, you're always fighting resistance here. And so we're going to start off with two of the things that I think are the most important forms of resistance in cycling. And the first one is rolling resistance. And that is the force that ends up opposing your forward motion when you're an object like a bicycle with tires that touch the road and they're rolling on the surface. There is force that pushes essentially against those tires from rolling forward. That's why it takes some effort to pedal to move forward. And the interesting thing about rolling resistance is it's what you expect. The things that impact that are effectively your tires and how the surface is. So, if you've got really, really low pressure in your tires are running flat, you notice how much harder it is to ride. So having those low pressure tires increases the rolling resistance, which is why we always want to make sure, if we're doing things right, which I frequently don't do, making sure that our inflation is at a certain pressure. Over time, our tires lose pressure, and that increases rolling resistance. Now, you may not notice it all that much if you've only lost a little bit over time, but if you've ever left your bike out for a while, say through the winter or something like that, your tires are going to be flat, if not really low in pressure. And that's why we really need to make sure that we are on top of ensuring that they are inflated to their proper pressure. It just makes things a lot easier. Now, sometimes we are going to lower that pressure because there is actual advantage in making sure that you have a little bit more contact with your tires and the surface. That's going to happen in a whole variety of places, especially for you folks who are riding on gravel. So if we're on trails, if we're on gravel, we actually want to increase that resistance paradoxically, because it actually means better contact, which means better grip, which means we're not going to fall over a lot. So sometimes we want a little bit more rolling resistance based on our tires and the pressure. The materials of the tire and the type of tires also are going to impact things. If you've got a slick tire, that's going to tend to have less rolling resistance compared to, say, a knobby tire. A wider tire obviously is going to have more contact, so wider tires have more rolling resistance. That's why you're not going to see a whole bunch of fat tire bikes that are going to be doing racing. They're going to be those skinny, slick tires. And this all sort of makes sense. Now, just like how the tire makes a big difference, so does the surface. So if you're going to be on a really, really nice, smooth paved surface, you'll notice real quickly how nice and easy riding that is. When you look at some of the racing bike surfaces, particularly in velodromes, absolutely, totally 100% flat in terms of the surface itself, even though it's angled. That's another thing. That's a totally different thing, although that also creates some resistance as well. But if you're on a rougher surface, like say chip seal, anytime you transition between good, awesome asphalt and then a chip seal, immediately you notice how much harder it is to ride. And it doesn't make much sense. It's a lot of sense. It's still very flat. It's still a relatively smooth surface, but not as smooth. So that's why you're sitting there going, why is this so much harder? And that's because the surface type impacts your rolling resistance as well. So whenever you're transitioning between a smoother surface and a rougher surface, or vice versa, you're going to notice a difference in effort. Sometimes you're going to find yourself having to shift as a result of that, but that of course gets into some other things as well when we talk about the biomechanics of riding. So surface, your tires, rolling resistance, all of this really matters in terms of what is fighting against you, that rolling resistance. So there's another type of resistance as well. And very often we get more of this than we really want. And that is air resistance. That's when we're basically bicycling through a gigantic liquid-like thing. It's not a liquid, it's a gas. I understand that. But, the idea is that you're cutting through this fluid. We'll use fluid. Fluid is actually the right term for me rather than liquid. You're cutting through this fluid to try to push yourself forward. So not only are you fighting the rolling resistance where you contact the surface of the ground, the road, the trail, whatever, you're also fighting through this fluid, the air, to try to move forward. And guess what? That also is going to be problematic for you in a couple of different ways. Number one, how fast are you going? the faster you go, you'll notice the more that you're getting that kind of breeze that hits you in the face. Well, that's you fighting through the fluid that is the air. The faster you go, the more drag you're going to have. But also, how you are shaped relative to that fluid, the air, is really going to matter too. Because if you are riding, the classic kind of bike touring 4-pannier design, you are basically riding with a gigantic parachute on you, for lack of a better way of putting it, right? Because you're hitting it very squarely no matter which direction you're going, relative to how the wind is. And so that's going to be certainly something that is an issue. Now, wind is certainly another factor as well. Wind, if it is coming right at you, makes the air resistance even stronger. We always talk about jokingly about invisible hills. Well, that's because it's just like rolling up a hill or rolling on a much worse surface when you've got more drag. That's why when you've got wind at you, your air resistance is up and it's just harder. So lots of different ways that you can handle both of these forms of resistance that I talked about. For the rolling resistance, you can alter your tires. You can alter the surfaces, change your route. That's going to matter based on that. You can change the size of your tires. Now, again, certain tires are going to be better in certain circumstances because sometimes you're having really low rolling resistance isn't going to help you all that much in certain riding situations. But with air resistance, we certainly know why going into a bike packing mode has become a lot more popular. It's not just less weight, which of course is a factor, but it's a whole lot less air resistance because you're more in line with the bike. We're not putting bags out on the side of the bike. It's all in line with the rider. So that really makes a big difference too. Your riding position also matters. All of the racers out there, you go into your aero bars to try to get down to cut through that air resistance too. So lots of different things that we can do to limit that air resistance if that matters for us. So these are the two things that are really fighting against us that we're trying to overcome. And how do we overcome all of that? Well, we got to generate energy and power. And these are physics terms. And again, not really awesome at physics myself, but for purposes of our conversation here, energy is the ability to do work. And that's akin to pedaling on the bike. Power is how quickly you can transform that energy when you pedal to move. So that's the difference between energy and power. So your pedaling is energy. Power is the transformation of that energy into movement. So that conversion of energy from basically food into mechanical energy is the thing that makes us all work. And that's also a really interesting thing. If you're ever interested in this, you can Google or use your AIs to talk about the efficiency of converting energy into mechanical motion when you're looking at, say, a combustion engine that uses petroleum fuels versus the calories that you eat in bicycling. You will find really quickly how much more efficient bicycling is in that energy conversion. It's really wild how incredibly efficient that energy and power conversion is for us as cyclists, which is pretty cool. You may see, especially if you do the fancy power measurements when you get on bikes, especially if you're on exercise bikes or something like that, sometimes you'll see the measurement of that power. It ends up getting measured in electrical terminology like watts, like how bright a bulb is. That's interesting to utilize as a way of thinking about things and measuring it based on a common thing that you are experiencing. So that's all really, I think, interesting when it comes to how we end up making that movement happen. One last thing that I think is interesting to talk about here in terms of the physics of cycling and what we need to overcome is gravity. And when we talk about gravity, it's also worth talking about hills too. Gravity, this might be file under duh, gravity is the reason why it's harder to pedal uphill. Why is that? Because we are fighting against the physics of gravity when we are going from low on a hill to high on a hill. And the reverse is also true. The reason why we don't have to pedal if we don't want to when we go down a hill is because gravity is actually the thing that is essentially pushing us down the hill. So it's handy, and it also ends up working against us. There's some interesting physics behind all of this, and it talks about potential energy versus kinetic energy. And I don't want to make this into a physics class, but potential energy is when you're at the top of the hill. At the top of the hill, you've got gravity and a host of other factors that basically say, hey, you've already earned this energy in some way, shape, or form by getting to the top of the hill. Maybe you biked up it. Maybe you live at the top of it. Maybe you got a ride up to the top of it. But whatever, when you're at the top of a hill, you've got potential energy. And when you just start rolling down that hill without having to pedal, without having to add any energy whatsoever, that is your conversion of potential energy into kinetic energy, which is the energy of movement. So that's the interesting thing behind physics of all of this as well. And this is a good time to think about the transition into the physics behind all of this and the biomechanics of riding and all the various tools that we have in our bicycle to convert all of these energies into potential energy to get us up the hill. But we're using a whole bunch of different advantages to make it easier for us to get up the hill. But the energy is always the same. You know, that's the whole concept of as we're spinning a lot to get up the hill, we're doing a lot of movements, more movement to get up that hill. And by using lower gears, we're spinning more. You spin more times in a circle as you pedal to get to the same amount of distance as versus a higher gear. And so ultimately, the amount of energy, the amount of potential energy that you gain to get up the hill always ends up being the same. We just use different ways of spending the kinetic energy to get up there in different ways. For those of us who cycle, it's always a lot easier to use those lower gears, but essentially, if someone gets up there on a fixie versus getting up there on a granny gear, like me, we end up having the exact same amount of potential energy when we end up at the top of the hill. Kind of an interesting little element of physics there. So this is a good time to transition to the biomechanics of riding. And what does biomechanics mean? It's basically how you as a human meat computer can transform your muscle actions into motion through the mechanical aspects of the bicycle. And where does that happen? Where is that connection happening? It's happening at the pedals. So we talk about pedaling efficiency as a big piece of all of this. Pedaling efficiency is a fancy way of saying how effectively are you as a rider in converting your energy into motion, into that power. The factors that impact that efficiency are multiple, and there's a little bit of controversy in all of this that I think I've talked about before. Where your foot is positioned on a pedal does matter. And the smoothness of your pedaling and the ability to maintain a steady rhythm, all of that is really, really important because as it turns out, it's not just a one-to-one thing of pedal stroke equals this kind of power output. How good you are and the way that you pedal really matters in terms of things. That's why just grinding away sometimes isn't necessarily the best way for you or the most efficient way for you to be able to convert your effort into moving forward. And that's also why we talk a lot about, especially going up hills, about being in lower gears and spinning into those gears. And the reason is that because that is the most efficient way for you to convert your energy into consistent motion. Because of the way that resistance, particularly rolling resistance, works, it's much better to be going at a particular rate and maintaining the minimal amount of cadence to push you forward. That is pedaling efficiency right there. That's why when you're struggling up a hill and you're really pressing in and you're not exactly hitting any kind of a good rhythm, that's why it feels like it's harder. It's because it is. And that's why it's always better to downshift if you can. Now, if you're like me and you end up being in your lowest gear and you're still struggling, well, that's another problem altogether. But that's why we want to be spinning into those hills as much as we possibly can. Another factor that's really important is in that human-bike interaction is how do we fit relative to the bicycle. And that's very often the bicycle frame. And the frame and the shape of that frame is going to be critical because we all have different body types. And just starting off with our height and our inseam, that's really going to make a big difference as to the size and shape of the bike that is right for us. If you've ever ridden a bike that is too small for you, you notice right away how uncomfortable that can be and how inefficient it is to pedal when you've got your knees coming up to your chin basically every time. Or the other way around, if you're on a bike that's way too big, how you can't quite get the power that you need because you're really stretching and reaching. And this is not sustainable in a long distance bit of bicycle travel. I don't have to tell anybody out there. But also it impacts our comfort level, the shape and the style and the size of the bike. Some of us like a more downward position. I am transitioning more into a more upright type of riding style as I look at changing how my bikes are. Why? Because I find it easier to go for longer distances that way. And if you could stay on the bike longer, that means that you could input more energy into your bike longer and science. So here it's a little bit more of comfort meets science, but the riding position and the shape and size of your frame really matters for all of this. And that's why it's critically important. And I just ran into this literally yesterday. I was riding to a conference. Actually, it was 2 days ago is how it started. And my bike saddle was, after I had brought it back from the cabin to here in DC, my bike saddle was too low and I just didn't have time to fix it. And it was only a 10-minute ride to the conference hotel in downtown DC. And so I just dealt with it. And it was just not great. It wasn't comfortable, but for a 10-minute ride, no problem. So I did that 10 minutes there and 10 minutes back. But yesterday, for the second day of the conference, you better believe I adjusted that saddle. Why? It was just more fun. It was just a lot easier. It made it a more enjoyable ride. Even for the 20 total minutes of riding, adjusting that seat height makes a huge difference. I've talked about how I'm trying to move more into a slightly more upright position on that particular bike. And I've utilized a variety of different risers and other things to heighten up the handlebar position. That's really made a big difference for my riding as well. I'd like to actually go a little bit higher, but for that, I'm probably going to have to make some additional changes and recable things. That's another story for another time. But those are some practical tips about that human bike interaction vis-a-vis the biomechanics of riding, how that works and why that works to make your riding better. The types of things that we'll talk very little bit here about muscle work and efficiency. Cycling is obviously very focused in on your legs, particularly your quadriceps. Those are the muscles between your knee and basically your hip bone, for lack of a better way of putting it. Your hamstrings, which are the contrary muscles on the other side of your leg, the large part of your leg, and your calves. Your calves also are really, really important here. But believe it or not, you really do need to be focused in on other muscles as well. Your core, the muscles around your stomach and your sides are critically important for maintaining balance and control. Same with your arms as well. Although we're not really using our arms anywhere near as robustly as our legs, our arms are still critically important for steering and balance and things like that. So the legs are the most important part, but you really don't want to miss out on the fact that you really need those as well to be proper in terms of your muscle use for all of this. And that's why warming up can be really important. I'm finding that's becoming more and more of a thing for me. I notice when I don't warm up. I've been used to all my entire life of just hopping on a bike and going, 60 miles. Well, now I'm starting to realize that that's not a great idea. And especially during breaks, how important it is to stretch and warm up things. It prevents injuries. It helps improve your performance. It's a good way to shake out some lactic acid that you build up through the day. A lot of good reasons to do all of that, because that, again, makes your muscles more efficient, and your muscles interact with the pedals, and the pedals create the power and the motion. All of these things are all interactive as well. I don't think it's a surprise to many of you that bicycle gearing is arguably the most important part of the biomechanics of riding, because that's the way that you can make the machine that is the bicycle that much more efficient for how you want to be able to ride. I probably should do an entire episode on this at some point, but I think I want to be a little bit more, technical is probably the better term, to talk about how the basics of the chain rings and the cogs and how the gearing is important and the chain is important and all of these various things. But for purposes of just the science episode here, gearing is the type of thing that changes the mechanical advantage. And as I talked about before, if you are on a fixie, you have one particular method of moving forward, and that is the mechanics of you pressing into the pedal literally just physically 1-to-1 turns that rear wheel, and for every revolution, it's the exact same amount of distance for every revolution of the pedals. When you have a geared bike, like most of us probably do, if you are rocking a fixie for bicycle travel, I salute you. You are awesome. If you have a single speed, I salute you as well. That is unlikely going to be my vibe ever, I don't think, because I really like the ability to change how my effort translates into the power that moves me forward. That's because if you are facing a hill, you are fighting now more than just the rolling resistance, more than just the air resistance. Now you're fighting gravity too. And so by changing gearing, it allows us to basically make a trade. And that trade is you're going to spin more, you're going to make more revolutions of the pedal, but your effort going into it changes because of the biomechanics of the gearing. So you're trading extra revolutions for effort. You're still going to end up going the same distance. You're still going to end up spending the same amount of energy to get to that potential energy point at the top of the hill. You're just going to be doing it in a more spread out way. So it's like the idea of making one gigantic payment for a computer or for a bike. Let's use a bike. Instead of just putting down all couple $1,000s on that bike, it's instead you're spreading it out. You're going to be making multiple payments on that to get to where you're going, to get that bike. And that makes it easier. So when you spread out payments, it's easier. Just like when you go into a lower gear, you're spreading out the effort over a longer amount of or an increased number of revolutions of your pedals. And that's why this all works. And that's why gearing in particular is the magic of bicycle travel, because you don't have to put in all of that energy output in a 1-to-1 way for absolutely everything that you do. And so that's, like I said, that's the magic of the efficiency of all of these types of things. And so when you're going uphill, it's worth the trade. Why? Because if you have to burn all of that effort to get to the top of the hill, you have a finite amount of calories in you. You have a finite amount of energy available to give to that particular ride. So if we were all on fixies, our bike tours in mountainous areas and in cool places with lots of hills would be, by definition, probably a lot shorter compared to if we have gearing. That's why touring bicycles, gravel bicycles, all of our bicycles for bicycle travel tend to have pretty good gears and pretty good climbing gears as well. Why? It allows us to go further. Again, I have heard of people who rock fixies for long, hilly tours, and they are just freaking super people as far as I'm concerned. Rock on. You're awesome. So, the biomechanics of riding really does rely so much on all of that, and that's the science behind everything. We are utilizing the technology of our bicycles and the gearing and all of those things as a method to make our movement more efficient. And like I said, there's all sorts of interesting science on the bicycle as being the most efficient way to move ever invented by human beings. We keep talking about combustion vehicles and now electric vehicles and things like that, hybrids. None of them raise a candle to the bicycle in terms of its efficiency for movement. And so that's it. Was this the most science-y type of episode ever? Maybe, but I just thought it was worth mentioning all of these things because it's been on my mind a little bit lately. And if you've never put any thought into it, and this maybe sparks your curiosity, there's tons of really great nerdy stuff on all of this, but there's also really good kind of basic stuff that explains all of these in much more detail. So this is meant to be just an overview for those of you who are curious on the topic. Maybe you don't really care that these things are classically efficient, or you don't care about the concepts of kinetic energy and potential energy. You don't have to. All you have to do is go out and ride and just let the science kind of be the thing over your shoulder the whole time, because it is what is making your bicycle trip and your bicycle travel that much more fun and that much more efficient. And as always, we like to close out the show with a special shout out to the Pedal Shift Society. Because of support from listeners like you, Pedal Shift is a weekly bicycle touring podcast with a global community, expanding into live shows and covering new tours. If you like what you hear, you can support the show for $5, $2, or even $1 a month. And there's one-shot and annual options if you're not into the small monthly thing. Check it all out at pedalshift.net/society. On to the society. Kimberly Wilson, Caleb Jenkinson, Cameron Lean, Andrew McGregor, Michael Hart, Keith Nagel, Brock Dittus, Thomas Skadow, Marco Lowe, Terrence Manson, Harry Telgadis, Chris Barron, Mark Van Ram, Brad Hipwell, Mr. T, Nathan Poulton, Stephen Dickerson, Vince LaGreco, Cody Florchinger, Tom Beninati, Greg Braithwaite, Sandy Pizzio, Jeff Muster, Seth Pollock, Joseph Quinn, Drew Porter, Byron Patterson, Joachim Robber, Ray Jackson, Jeff Fry, Kenny Mikey, Lisa Hart, John Denkler, Steve Hankel, Miguel Quinones, Alejandro Aviles Reyes, Keith Spangler, Greg Towner, Jody Zaranin, Lucas Barwick, Michael Baker, Brian Bechtal, Reinhard Bigel, Greg Middlemiss, Connie Moore, William Gothman, Brian Benton, Joan Churchill, Mike Bender, Rick Weinberg, Billy Crafton, Gary Matushak, Greg Latoile Lopez, James Sloan, Jonathan Dillard, John Funk, Ronald Paroli, Dave Roll, Brian Hafner, Misha LeBlanc, Ari Messenger, David Kropke, Todd Grossbeck, Wally Estrella, Sue Reinert, John Lico, Stephen Granada, Philip Mueller, Robert Lackey, Dominic Carroll, Jackie McCullough, John Hickman, Carl Presseau, David Neves, Patty Louise, Terry Fitzgerald, Peter Steinmetz, Timothy Fitzpatrick, Michael Azuski, Hank O'Donnell, David Zanoni, David Weil, Matthew Sponsella, Chad Reno, Spartan Dale, Carolyn Ferguson, Peggy Littlefield, Lauren Allensmith, Eric Burns, Thomas Pearl, Darren McKibben, Richard Stewart, Dave Fletcher, Jack Smith, Luke Parkinson, Ryan Patterson, Cyrus Faravar, John Gardner, Sam Scruggs, Dwight Pintinger, Connie Bowder, Rob Merrifield, and thanks to all past and anonymous folks for helping make this show happen. Thank you for joining. You can find Pedal Shift at pedalshift.net for more great bicycle touring content. You can hear the Pedal Shift project through Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his self-titled album. The track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Mono Mono, wherever cool music is available.